now start. The journey it now start.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Could I invite my fellow Benedictines to take a seat? We're about to start a few minutes late. Unfortunately, Lord Abbot will not be here because of another pressing function at the Cathedral for late Archbishop Panton. So we have the distinct Professor Reginald Renwick to the opening prayer for us. And we got on the way a few minutes late. My apologies.
Good afternoon, dear brothers and sisters. My name is Reginald Renwick, and I'm a graduate of St. Benet's College and a past student of Samuel Secondary also. And let us all bow our heads, please, for a few minutes. Thank you. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks and praise because, as your word says, it is always right and just to give you thanks. And we say thank you today for this gathering, which is about to begin. We thank you for all those who are here, all those who did the groundwork in preparing everything, the publication, getting the place together, the invitees, and everyone. We give you thanks and praise. And we also would give you thanks and praise for the wonderful discussions that we have today. Make this a fruitful and inspirational success. Heavenly Father, we say thank you again. And may everyone here benefit from what is being done today. In the name of Jesus, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And the church says, amen. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Benedictines, I am extremely proud to have been chosen to chair this auspicious meeting as we relaunch Dr. Don Basil Matthew's Crisis in the West Indian Family. You know, in this 21st century, there's a lot of chat about artificial intelligence. And when you look, if you have had the opportunity to peruse the publication of Crisis in the West Indian Family, you would recognize that whereas a lot of it refers to what has happened in the families that were saddled or challenged with slavery, you have to understand the kind of visionary that Dr. Don Basil Matthews was. You see, just for example, looking around this very auspicious group, how many of us are considered white or free from slavery? How many of us understand that in this century, that is the major group of citizens on the planet that will really drive the development of God's planet Earth? So that when I refer to Don Basil as an absolute visionary. Let me take you back to the early 1940s, just before he got his PhD. He was invited by Dr. Eric Williams to come to Howard to help develop a conference which in turn turned out to be a reflection on what was happening at the time with respect to the American and British venture into taking control of the Caribbean and South American countries. And Dr. Don Basil Matthews said, to paraphrase his comments and commentaries at that time, is that it was intolerable for the British and the Americans to so position themselves to take advantage of our regional and South American peoples. And clearly, if that was not considered visionary then, what is it today in 2025? And so, approximately 10 years later, he returned to his beloved Trinidad and Tobago to publish Crisis of the West Indian Families. And is it not relevant that we can use the proverbial hindsight to say the man really knew what he was talking about? That is the kind of man that walked this earth among us, even though he would have already qualified with his PhD from Fordham University in New York, and could have taken the opportunity, as is being done now, for the black intellectuals in our church, the Catholic Church, to position themselves closer to Vatican City. He did not choose to do that. And you will appreciate that at that time, a PhD perhaps could be equivalent to us now, each of us driving a Rolls Royce. But it was so few and far between at the time. And whereas my opportunity to have met him was during my pre-teen years at the San Fernando Parish, where the Benedictines were in control at that time. But it's to be noted that the Benedictines had formed the first St. Benedict's College, where today stands Presentation College. And as soon as they found they could not persist with that vocation, they handed it over to the Presentation Brothers of Ireland. But a few short years after this publication, he would have gone on to challenge certain authorities at the Mount St. Benedict, where he was an outstanding anointed priest and scholar. But of course, to be brutally frank, his color did not allow him, notwithstanding his intellectual capacity and graduation, to take control of the monastery. That being said, the Archdiocese had him assigned to the San Fernando parish, where in my early days as a very junior acolyte, I had the opportunity and honor to serve him. But the Archbishop at the time, Count Finbarayan, an Irish, understood what was happening at the Mount and took, as it were, under his wing. Archbishop was also a PhD graduate, Dr. Don Basil Matthews, and for good reason. It was there approximately 2 years after this publication, 1955, that he was asked to challenge the then Secretary to the Colonies, Dr. Eric Williams, with respect to their attempt to take control of educational development in Trinidad and Tobago. And the Archbishop said he would like Dr. Don Basil Matthews to deal with Dr. Williams on that. You see, and that he took absolute control of, and of course that gave rise to the famous lecture debates at the public library, which is now home of the Dr. Williams historical reference documents. But Dr. Don Basil Matthews understood that since the particular religion from whence he came was the major educational force in the colony, he not only dealt with Dr. Williams with respect to using references to Aristotle, but also to ensure that all educational institutions, all, to this day, have the right to control the educational development of our youth. And rising out of that came the now well-noted and perhaps famous and sometimes criticized, the Concordat. So that document was signed by Father Valdez of the Holy Ghost Fathers, but only because Dr. Don Basil Matthews did all the legwork and made it possible for the church to take that stand on behalf of all religions. And of course, in that regard, the rest is history. So today, we still have thousands of our youth being given the opportunity to choose between church-run institutions or state institutions. Now, why would he have done such a thing? The man was anointed. He was educated. He had this love for his God, his church, his country, and all his people. And that is what we are seeing, even in that book that he did a few years earlier. And even in his criticism of the British and the Americans in the early 40s. You see, my dear ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Basil Matthews was no ordinary person, but he was a very humble man. Very humble. And he ensured that whatever he did benefited thousands of youth, not only in St. Benedict's, La Romaine, but also throughout the country, throughout the Republic. So as we move on to listen to the very informed and illustrious presenters this afternoon, I ask you to keep that in mind, that this man who graduated as a priest in 1935 and went on to be educated in Belgium and then in New York, and then to have different opportunities throughout North America, Howard in particular, and then decide to settle, put his bucket down here in Trinidad. Bear in mind, St. Benedict's, La Romaine is but a grain of sand of the capacity and the devotion of Dr. Basil Matthews. So, without further ado, and perhaps to get us back on schedule, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Alvin Weeks, an executive member of the Basil Matthews Foundation, to share a few words with us. Alvin?
Good evening to everyone present. As I said, I am Alvin Weeks. I have been a member of the alumni for over 30 or more years. And as such, I was able to have a deep awareness and love, as Richard would have said, for the work of Basil Matthews. So that in September 2011, this year represented the centennial year of Dr. Basil Matthews' birth. And he, being the late esteemed founder and principal emeritus of our alma mater, as well as the 55th anniversary of the school, in recognition of his seminal contribution towards the religious, intellectual, political, education, sporting, and cultural landscape of our republic, I, on behalf of the Past Students Association, sought to have one of his books, which is Crisis in the West Indian Family, reprinted in his honor. This, I thought, will be a fitting tribute to his outstanding life, since what he propounded in his dissertation is quite contemporary, and therefore I sought approval from his cousin, the late Professor Lawrence Wilson, to undertake this venture, and I penned a letter dated April the 27th, 2011. Professor Wilson indicated that he will be quite willing to forward approval for this worthwhile venture after consultation with the Wilson family, of which Basil was an integral part. He also stipulated that we check with other institutions or individuals who have been given rights to Basil writings in his will. Furthermore, he advised that we have a distinguished social scientist review the book in order to write a contemporary foreword to the reprinted version. Keeping with these stipulations, we have complied and also had Professor Dave Traboulet, PhD, a past student of St. Benedict's College and former Professor Emeritus of History, City University of New York, who provided an introduction for the 21st century edition of Crisis of the West Indian Family. In closing, I wish to remonstrate that Don Basil embodies all attributes of the human spirit. At our 30th anniversary, like Jesus did, he said, "What good can come out of Nazareth?" Don Basil also said, "What good can come out of La Romaine?" Today we see St. Benedict's College with a proven history of 69 years and thousands of past and present students being beneficiaries of a comprehensive type education. So I say, long live St. Benedict's College, long live the Venerable Dom Stephen Basil Matthews, OSB, PhD, Principal Emeritus of our St. Benedict's College. Nihil omnino Christo. I thank you.
I knew we could do better than that for my brother, Alvin. Thank you. It is small wonder that when I formed the Don Basil Matthews Foundation, separate and apart from the Past Students Association of the college, that Alvin was one of those who were eagerly awaiting the invitation and was so willing to come forward to be part of the foundation. Perhaps I should give you a little insight as to what the foundation is all about. You heard me say that St. Benedict's La Romaine is but a grain of sand of the intellectual capacity and the contribution that Don Basil Matthews gave to this country and indeed to the region. You would recall very often Benedict's La Romaine was referred to as the football college. But there again, he understood before all the quote-unquote intellectuals and academia that sport was the real chariot on which our youth could come forward. What is it today around the world? Who are demanding the real benefits of economic prosperity? Clearly, the sportsmen, whether it's in soccer, whether it's American football, whether it's NBA, you name it, whether it's track and field. Our brothers in the north are known because they have a fellow called, That's right, because he's still considered to be one of the fastest men on the track. And that not only supersedes, but replaces in a very significant way a favorable impact on economic and sociological development in our societies. Sports more than ever, definitely not politics, right? And our people are beginning to develop in that trade. He used to say, he said, fellas, how many doctors and lawyers you think this little Trinidad could absorb? haven't we lived to see in recent times doctors, especially the young interns, say, they don't have no work? That is the man, when he was saying that in the 60s, people laugh at him. So, continuing along those lines, I would now like to invite Mr. Burton Sankarali to give us his overview on the book and the relationship and relaunch. Mr. Sankarali is a philosopher and lecturer. And, sir, the mic is yours.
Hello, hello. There's a line of poetry I want to start with by the great Martin Carter. He says, "Till I collect my scattered skeleton." And I find that appropriate to the DOM. A bit of false advertising. I'm going to say a few words about the DOM primarily, right? Who I was really properly introduced to through Kasala Kamara's kind of like compiled biography that we have some copies here. Concerning Don Basil Matthews and the way he was erased from history. And we are now in the process of trying to piece together what we have lost because we don't preserve this kind of knowledge. Often there are forces that want it that way, that seek to suppress that kind of knowledge, here and in the metropolitan centers as well, right? Here's an African Trinidadian man and Catholic priest, producing this very important work. I do want to say my impression is, without knowing the work very well, that it is a potentially very controversial work. Which is as it should be, I would say, because it is around controversy and intelligent intellectual engagement the process moves forward. So for me, the coming panel is really what it's about. So I'm just saying a few things. But yeah, he was erased. He was, I don't know, suppressed, but certainly in terms of the state and in terms of even the academy, which he played such an important role in. He can be considered the founder of sociology in Trinidad. That's one very important area. His contribution to football, he can, I think, be considered with very strong historical cogency. He can be considered the architect who founded that process that took us to the World Cup. When you understand the history of what he did in St. Benedict's College, training these young men, bringing in foreign coaches, getting the whole thing formalized, that carried over into the squad that nearly did it in Haiti and that infamous something back in the 70s, and then his role in the Football Association. And for that alone, he should be remembered, But this kind of erasure, So that's my first point. My second point, and my next 2 points might seem a little bit indulgent in terms of my own interest. My second point revolves around that philosopher guy, Aristotle, right? Because how I would think I mostly knew about him before is in terms of these debates with Eric Williams on Aristotle. And how many countries can boast that's so important in its formative period was a philosophical debate on Aristotle or on some such philosophical figure. I believe Eric Williams, I remember hearing years ago, I should say, I don't know how correct it is, that Eric Williams referred to Trinidad as the Athens of the Caribbean and the like. So, these two intellectual giants of the Western intellectual tradition battling it out over Aristotle. And I could remember, I don't believe he was Abbott at the time, but now Abbott telling me about this years ago, saying when they were discussing this, the people were like, crying out for, we want more Aristotle, we want more Aristotle. We come from that kind of intellectual ferment within the framework available at the time, the Western intellectual tradition, which formed people like C.L.R. James and Lloyd Best, and along with Eric Williams and Naipaul, all out of Queen's Royal College. How many American colleges of that size or even bigger could claim having figures like that? And there was this debate over Aristotle. And I made a comment in the review I did of the biography that's one thing. I never thought that I would get to read the text that comes from that great debate. It's something you hear about, but Trinidadians talk about things, but we don't preserve things. Say, yeah, boy, that was a good debate, boy. They're talking Aristotle. Yeah, but what they talk about? And I never thought I'd get a chance to read and to comment on it as I did, at least on Dom Basil's side. I'm wondering whether I was a little bit unfair to Eric Williams. I mean, I said we don't have his text. Maybe his estate does. I don't know if it's in the library or not. The text of his side of that debate. I said we have his praxis, how he implemented it, relating to Aristotle and education and the role of the education process and the state. Now, Aristotle saw really the state as a school, right? That's not going to work with a modern Western nation state, which is what Eric Williams ended up implementing. But it's quite possible, that's why I said I may be unfair, that Eric Williams had something else in mind in those days of the education process. So that would have been an interesting exchange in terms of this notion of the state as part of an educating process. He might have had that in mind. As far as I know, we don't have his text of that to say, But Dom Basil argued for Aristotle in terms of this kind of, what you might now say, theological or spiritual kind of process that you see in Aristotle and his philosophies of teleology, of a kind of a metaphysical purpose. And it's an important debate, and it's great that we now have access through that biography to at least one side of that argument. Maybe someday we will get some of Eric Williams. Maybe it could be published again with a proper foreword, placing it in history and philosophically. That would be, I think, an important thing for our country. And as a country, we can boast that we came out of this kind of intense intellectual discussion, but how we have fallen. Look at what the state we're in now. How we have fallen. It's really very sad. And we have not appreciated Dom Basil's contribution. And one saying kind of comes to mind that ingratitude worse than obeah. So what you expect, right? The third area I want to look at with Dom Basil, Dom Basil is it's the area that I came out of, which is theology. Actually, my sole tertiary degree is in theology. But I think it's very appropriate in this case because, face it, Dom Basil is in all likelihood the most important Catholic intellectual this country has produced. I can't think of anyone close, really, in terms of an intellectual whose intellectual vision in a very profound way was shaped by the Catholic tradition. In my review, I kind of grapple with this Catholic and Western tradition and the ancestral traditions we have here, particularly the African tradition. I grapple with that in my review. But he's an important or a key Catholic intellectual who, again, his own church has forgotten, really. So again, we're doing this. And it comes up in the biography that some may want to argue that he belonged to a tradition called liberation theology, which kind of exploded in the Catholic Church from the 1970s. There were these theologians basically applying the Bible and tradition to issues of liberating the poor, and sometimes often using a Marxist analysis, which the Vatican did not like. From the 1930s, Dom Basil was engaging this kind of process, right? And that should be noted. Maybe with limitations at times, but he was engaging that process. I'm not saying we call him a liberation theologian. That is for people far more advanced in these things than myself to make that determination and for more access to his work. But he was part of this process of a liberating theological vision that drove the education process in St. Benedict's, our first comprehensive school, in the sense of what comprehensive means. Let that sink in, our first, he started. Coming out of this theological vision he had. It's very interesting because here I want to get a little bit more into the theology side and the church. Perhaps the golden age theologically in the church, at least in this sector of the Caribbean, or sectors of the Caribbean, happened in the 1970s. In the wake of Black Power, there was a movement inside the churches that was taking on board this liberation theology thing, this issue of liberating people. And some amazing stuff. It was spearheaded by our own Idris Hamid, who came from St. Andrew's Theological College. Someone who's still alive worked with him, Nolly Clark, Father Dean Canon Nolly Clark, who was one of my teachers, actually, who's still with us. And they pioneered this very important movement. I mean, the umbrella turned out being the Caribbean Conference of Churches, and they would have been linking with people like Rodney and Maurice Bishop and all this kind of thing. At one point, this institution was referred to as the Communist Conference of Churches. But of course, it didn't last long in the 70s. Eventually, it seems officialdom stifled it, which is how these things happen if we're not prepared to fight for them. But it has some important offshoots. The CCC continued doing some work, which I was a part of some years after, like I did work in the area of interfaith dialogue. An important offshoot seems to be a somewhat remarkable institution in Jamaica, an ecumenical Protestant seminary called UTCWI, United Theological College, that I, as far as I can tell, attempted to remain faithful to this practice. And then in the Catholic Church here, you would get some people trying to continue to do meaningful theology. There are some Catholic theologians now doing that. And then the seminary, the Catholic seminary where I studied, was grappling again with these issues in this context of relating the church to the modern world and to the world we are living to, post-Vatican Council and all of that. And I was a part of that theological reflecting in my own formation. The point I want to make in regard to the DOM is that if you were not so badly, one almost wants to say fatally, sidelined and silenced, and what contribution could he have made? I mean, here there still are, and certainly in the 70s you were seeing it, progressive forces in the church institution that is so powerful in our culture, often was and is a reactionary institution. But there are these progressive forces playing out in the 70s. There are these movements and currents under that umbrella, and they did not have access to the insights and the wisdom of Dom Basil Matthews, And that's really my closing reflection here, Had they had access to those insights, had more progressive forces been able to shape the work of the church, considering how powerful the church is in our society, had such forces been invigorated by Dom Basil, I suggest our history today could have been very different. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Brother Burton Sankarali. You see, as fate would have it, during the course of the past 5-7 days, I was reflecting on certain things with respect to Africa in the church and the church's foundation. And for those of us who have not taken time to read Genesis and Exodus and Deuteronomy and different Isaiah and different Gospels, you would not be able to link what is perceived to be the black contribution to the church. So that when Don Basil came on the scene, I remember that his very chalice represented in its different designs the Uganda martyrs. Because the very root of the Christian church is not just founded in the Bible, but is founded with a significant contribution of Africa, black Africa, to the church. But of course, we have been made to believe otherwise, that it was a Eurocentric church. That is not so. The Bible spells it out very clearly. And a quick example. How was Adam created? From the dust of the earth. And God breathed life into it. What earth is white? Not even the Sahara Desert. Think about it. And that is in Genesis. Also, to reference is made very much of Aristotle. And of course, Dr. Williams also referred to Aristotle in those debates. But Don Basil went back to Plato, which is where Aristotle was getting some of his material from. When Dr. Williams was trying to, what you call it, nationalize education system. And in summary, what Don Basil was saying is, listen, you may want to do that, but there can be no proper development of education without significant spiritual roots. That's what he was saying. And when Dr. Williams continued to talk about Aristotle, Don Basil said, but listen, the information that Dr. Williams is getting it from Aristotle. Aristotle got his information from Plato. And Plato is the one who showed Aristotle, whether he wanted to recognize it or not, that there were certain definite spiritual footings for educational development. May I now invite Dr. Sasha Joan Charles Baines, who, as is noted, fell in love with sociology as a child when she stumbled across the book Persistent Poverty, written by George Beckford. Her exposure to the impact of colonialism and injustice stirred her desire to study sociology at A levels, which set her apart to a PhD in social policy at the University of the West Indies, which she successfully defended and graduated in 2018, a very youthful graduate. This is 25. She is an educator and at the secondary level and adjunct lecturer at the University of the West Indies and UWI Open Campus, in which she teaches several sociology courses. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Sasha Joan Charles Baines to share her thoughts with us. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. And it is my honor and pleasure to give my thoughts about Don Basil Matthews' work from a sociological perspective, focusing on his methodology. And research is a very vital tool in any modern society. It provides a snapshot of current trends of our social reality and a glimpse into historical realities which can be used to predict the future. And in the West Indies, we have not always been fortunate to tell our own story, as there was a heavy reliance on Western research which focused on the social problems specific to European society. And it left little room for understanding and far less appreciating our Caribbean experience. So this reliance on European ideals set the standard to measure the family type, the function of the family, and their experience. And when I thought about Don Basil's work, I thought about a sociologist by the name of George Peter Murdoch, who wrote his study about the social structure, entitled Social Structure, in 1949. And his work was boasted of having surveyed over 250 societies, in which he created the definition of the family. And I thought that's really important because a definition sets the tone for what something is, and at the same time, it sets the tone for what something is not. And I just want to share with you his definition. He defined the family as being a social group characterized by common residence, economic cooperation, and reproduction, including adults of both sexes and one or more children, owned or adopted, of the sexually cohabiting adults. And when I thought about Murdoch's definition, I really focused on the term socially accepted relationship. That has a lot of implications. And that was a really popular study at that particular point in time, because it sets the standard by which the family should be measured. And by his boasting of studying over 250 societies, saying that his study is so comprehensive that most types of families fall within this mold. And what is really interesting about his study is that he talks about the fact that this family type is the ideal family type. And he describes any other variation of this family type as a family gone wrong. I want you to think about that for a moment. What is significant about the stories that we tell ourselves, especially when we hear it from a European and American lens, is that sometimes we're not able to appreciate the circumstances that give rise to our reality. And Don Basil Matthews' work is really important because it helps us understand who we were at that particular point in time and the circumstances that occurred. Now, in the 1940s, we were a relatively young society, having been subjected to colonial rule by the very Europeans who told us who we were as a people and judged by their standards, many times with a disapproving nod of our familial systems. Context, however, matters. And I really wanted to expand on Don Basil's work because this curiosity of the story that we have as West Indians is really important. This curiosity that he had led to his work, The Crisis of the West Indian Family, with a specific focus on the non-legal union and common law marriage. And it's important to really reflect on the use of his term non-legal, because in his work, he talks about the fact that he would rather use that term as opposed to illegal, because it has implications in terms of setting a particular tone by which we should judge the creation of these unions that were created. His work is noteworthy for several reasons. It provides great insight into the impact upon European civilization, upon the Afro-West Indian family. But it could also be used to help us appreciate and understand the other types of families within our West Indian context. This is important. Our history is really important. And when we think about Murdoch's definition, bringing it back to the socially approved acceptable relationship, the organization of the family in the West Indies, it was due to colonialism and slavery. When we look at other ethnicities, we think about their story and how they existed. For instance, the East Indians, they were brought through indentureship, and they were allowed to maintain their family structures. And even though their marriage, for instance, for East Indians, or for Hindus rather, it wasn't recognized until the mid-1940s. For Muslims, that happened in 1936. We have to understand how these groups were able to develop in terms of their familial systems. This was a different reality, however, for the Afro-West Indian family. For one, they were brought to the Caribbean through slavery. And their experience during slavery set the tone for the creation of their family patterns. And it's really interesting to also follow the development in the post-slavery era as they struggle to establish themselves as free men and free women. The stories we tell are important. When Basil reflected on what has been touted as the culture of Africans in the Caribbean, he spoke about the impact that colonialism had on the structure of the family. And the story that these non-legal unions, this level of promiscuity, the disorganization of the family, it was created and represented as their culture, he indicated that this is not exactly accurate. As a matter of fact, in looking at the tribes that were common to Trinidad, he recognized that many individuals came from the Yoruban tradition. And because he decided to dwell further on the culture of the Yoruban tradition, he found actually that marriage and a stable family unit was highly valued in this particular culture. And so to tell the story that a disorganized familial unit that was associated with Africans in the Caribbean, it's not exactly true. He also examined the practice of polygamy. And he found that it was a rare practice. And it was specific to persons of higher status, with systems in place that dominated the practice of this. And looking at polygamy in the Caribbean, he found that it was caused due to disruptive practices, because a lot of families were intentionally separated. The intention was to destabilize the family unit. And it was really important that the family unit for Afro-West Indian families were done because it was important to maintain the social structure as is. You see, a stable family unit, strong familial bonds, create the opportunity for persons to unite and for persons to rebel against the system that existed at that time. And to maintain the power of whites and the practice of colonialism, it was really in the interest of the plantation owner to ensure that we were divided. The separation was also done with an economic perspective. We were mainly looked at simply persons fit for labor. It didn't matter who you were. And so the economy, together with the interest of maintaining power, was the intention to destabilize the West Indian, Afro-West Indian family. When we think about the labels as well, in terms of what is legitimate, we also get an opportunity to examine who determines what is legitimate and who determines what is not legitimate. The value of marriage is also important to assess during the slavery era as well as the post-emancipation era. The reports that spoke about the illegitimate unions, it was done through the lens of the plantation owner. And the church also had a very important role because when I spoke earlier, I mentioned when the legitimate marriages between the other religious groups were recognized. And so if we paid attention to the report of these illegitimate unions, if you were not married, in particular, according to Roman Catholic rites, your union wasn't exactly seen as being legitimate. And as we evolved into a class-based society, the standard of being married became important, specifically for the upper and middle class individuals as opposed to the working class persons. The fact that Don Basil's work was written is important because it takes ownership of our realities. We get to dictate our own story. And this was really important if we think about the historical context and value of his work, because a lot of the highlighted work was really touted by other sociologists who presented their ideals, their research on the family, but through the Eurocentric and American gaze. And many times those stories were done devoid of the Caribbean reality. His approach of an ethnographic one is important because the participants also played a role in being able to frame the story of the family in Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension the Caribbean, in rich and in-depth detail to fully elucidate how our culture, beliefs, practices, and social dynamics evolved. And this voice was necessary given the dearth of research on our side of the globe. Matthew's work can be said to stand the test of time. His use of over 250 interviews, it ensures that validity and depth to ensure that the academic standard of research is one of a high standard, which can withstand scrutiny to research conducted today in our modern era. The extensive sample size, varied sources of data, and a shared determination to seek information at a time in which historical data might not always be documented is really important for the development of research and understanding how we came to be and who we are today. And this has proven to be beneficial in a comprehensive exploration of our social reality of the family over centuries and decades. While his work was certainly pivotal to West Indian research, no research, and as such his work, is not without critique. In looking at the sources of his work, it can be seen to be colored by the view of planters, in which their view and documentation of realities of non-whites may be tainted by their discriminatory views, one that he acknowledges in his book as being potentially problematic. Depending on the lens that you take as a researcher, perhaps as a positivist one, you may argue that his ethnographic work cannot be replicated in other settings. But his work has relevance. And based on the dearth of research in other settings in our West Indian society, it's important to showcase the context of our culture and social realities to aid in our developmental efforts in our relatively new society at that time and in the present and future. His research serves as a foundation for future researchers to reference the realities of the Afro-West Indian family, and by extension, the West Indian family, and serves to impact policy development, nation building, and it stimulates this discussion of where do we go from here. The challenge is therefore left to researchers to build upon his legacy and contribute to the sociology discourse of the West Indian family. Thank you.
Certainly a very enlightening and detailed report on the crisis in the West Indian family. I can just share with you my own problem with the misnomer. Because of that European who thought he had gotten to India, we are called West Indian, but we are really west of Africa. And to come back to the visionary work of Dr. Basil Matthews, in that crisis of the West Indian family, perhaps had he written that in the last half, or quarter rather, of the 20th century, he would have been forced to reflect on the habits of those of us who were not slaves. How many of us are familiar with the Chinese or the Indians or the mulattoes, or as we say, the French Creole, who practice like the characters in his publication with non-legal families? That should ring a bell. You see, the truth is, a large percentage of our society today is really founded on that behavior. But for respect, a particular individual's name goes on the birth certificate as father. Sounds familiar, eh? So it really isn't simply the West Indian family as he did the research to produce in 1953. So, what's the expression? If the cap fit, you pull the string. Eh? So that clearly what he did then, perhaps without knowing it, but I believe that he had enough capacity to have the vision that he was really referring to our total society. It is my pleasure to invite Shivan Ramlal, historian and author, to share a few words with us. Thank you, Shivan. Let's welcome.
A pleasant good evening, Mr. Chairman, scholars, authors, specially invited guests, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and fellow past students of St. Benedict's College like myself. This evening, we do not simply gather to discuss a book. No. We engage in an intellectual excavation, peeling back layers of history, dusting off buried truths of our collective past, and holding them up in the light for everyone to see. This evening, we confront the past, wrestle with its weight, and demand an honest reckoning with its consequences. We stand at the crossroad of history and reality, between the echoes of the plantation and the modern Caribbean household, between the legacies of oppression and the resilience of the people, of our people. The family, as noted, is the bedrock of our society. It is where values are passed down, where children first learn love, discipline, and identity. But what happens when people are denied their right to family? What happens when generations are born into a system that uproots fathers, commodify mothers, and fractures bonds between siblings? The answer to that question is written across the Caribbean in the structure of the West Indian family. A family born in crisis, molded in slavery, and forced to survive against all odds. The book before us, The Crisis of the West Indian Family by Basil Matthews, is not a passively historical study. It is a mirror that forces us to look at ourselves, our families, our traditions, and ask the uncomfortable question: how much of who we are today is still dictated by a history we never chose? Matthews' writing in 1952 stood at a critical juncture in our history, a time when Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean were still colonies, just beginning to grapple with their impending independence. When West Indian intellectuals were starting to challenge the narratives imposed upon them, and Matthews among them, dissecting a social crisis that too many people ignored. His book remains a landmark study, not just because of the depth but because it dares to name the plantation as the root of the problem. He does not romanticize the past. Instead, he tells the raw, unfiltered truth. The Caribbean was still firmly under colonial rule. The independence movement has not erupted into full force. And yet, in this moment of transition, he dared to ask the question few were willing to. Why is the West Indian family in crisis? He does not leave this question unanswered. He places his finger firmly on the pulse of history and finds his lifeblood tainted with the residue of slavery, colonialism, and economic injustice. And in his characteristic way, he strips away the sentimental narratives of Caribbean life and presents to us the stark reality, and I quote, "The non-legal union is a cultural hybrid." He writes, "It is neither African nor Christian, nor Western. It is a New World phenomenon. Without a New World plantation, the non-legal union is unexplained." To understand why the West Indian family is in crisis, we have to go to the root. The plantation is that root. It was not merely an agricultural estate. It was not just a location where sugar was grown, coffee was harvested, cocoa was processed. Slavery was not just about labor. It was a social experiment in total domination. The plantation was not merely an economic system. It was a factory that designed a particular kind of society, one in which people were disconnected from their history, their family, and even themselves. The plantation was an entire social system, a mechanism of control designed to break bonds, fracture relationships, and erase family ties. Slavery on the plantation was unlike slavery in any part of the world. In Africa, a slave might still retain family identity. In parts of Asia, servitude did not always mean generational bondage. But here in the Caribbean, the plantation economy dictated everything, even the most intimate aspects of human lives. Imagine a mother giving birth, knowing her child was not hers. That baby fresh from the womb belonged to the estate. The child could be sold at a whim. A father could not claim his son. A husband had no legal rights over his wife. And let us consider the conditions of the enslaved family as expounded by Don Basil Matthews. One, marriage was illegal. There were no church ceremonies, no family names passed down, no legal recognition of unions. A man and woman might consider themselves husband and wife, but their relationship meant nothing in the eyes of the law. Children were not their parents' own. They were property, livestock, to be sold at the whim of the master. And Matthew described this, and I quote, "A system in which a slave family was of no more consequence than the livestock on the estate." A mother might nurse a child at dawn, only to have him sold away at noon. A father might watch his wife be taken as a concubine by the estate owner, powerless to stop it. Fathers were ghosts. The very structure of plantation life, where men and women were often assigned different tasks on different estates or work gangs, meant that fathers had little roles in their children's life. The mother was the only stable figure, and she was at the mercy of the estate. Matthews doesn't romanticize the suffering. He does not dress it in poetic tragedy. He is blunt, and I quote, "To the plantation owner," Matthews is saying, "everything, including the slave family, was incidental. The only thing that mattered was labor, cheap labor." That result, the result was not just a generation of displaced people, but centuries of disrupted kinship, lost lineage, and shattered relationships. The chains of slavery was legally broken in 1838, but freedom did not bring stability. The ex-slaves were cast into a world where they were free in name, but not in circumstance. No land grant was given. No economic security was provided. The former enslaved people were left to fend for themselves, while the plantation economy continued to demand their labor under new terms. What emerged was what Matthews called the non-legal union, not as a cultural preference, not as an inherited African custom, but as a survival mechanism forced upon the people by history. Not because Afro-Caribbean people did not value marriage, but because the conditions for marriage were simply out of their reach. If emancipation ended slavery, why did the plantation mentality survive into the 20th century? Why did non-legal unions remain so common even after independence? Matthews conducted field surveys in villages across Trinidad, from Blanchisseuse to Muruga, from Toko to Point Fortin, and found that the highest rate of non-legal unions were in areas where plantation economy still dominated, where wages were low, where land was scarce, where laborers had little control over their futures. There, marriage was rare. Matthews observed, in rural areas where plantations remained dominant, non-legal unions were more prevalent. In more urbanized areas, economically diverse areas, legal marriages increased. In districts with strong Catholic influence, marriage rates were significantly higher. These facts led to one inevitable conclusion. Where economic stability was strongest, formal marriages flourished. Where poverty was greatest, non-legal unions dominated. And yet, in the book, despite the overwhelming evidence that this practice was born out of economic hardship, Matthews observed one cruel social contradiction. And I quote, the feeling of not being sufficiently socially respectable to enter marriage is often characteristic of persons in non-legal union. This is one of the greatest tragedies of our colonial inheritance, that the very people denied marriage by history came to believe that they are unworthy of it. Matthews does not merely generalize. He tests his theory with comparative analysis, as explained. And one of his most compelling revelations came from his study of factory and field workers in the Trinidad sugar industry. Factory workers, predominantly Afro-Creoles, were well paid. Some earned more than teachers in 1940, and yet they obviously rejected legal marriages. Field workers, predominantly the East Indians, earned half as much, and yet they spent significantly on elaborate weddings, dowries, and religious rites. Why? If financial stability was the only factor, then the factory workers who had more money should have been more likely to marry. But they weren't. The reason Matthew argues lies not in economics, but in historical conditioning. And I quote, wherever economic instability was greatest, legal marriage was rarest. The feeling of not being sufficiently socially respectable to enter marriage. Matthew's right, he continues, is often characteristic of persons in non-legal union. In other words, marriage was seen as something for the privileged. For those struggling to survive, it was an ideal too far out of reach. But even as he acknowledges the endurance of non-legal unions, Matthews dismisses the myth that it was inherited from Africa. He writes, "There is no such thing as an accredited non-legal union either in West Africa in general or in Nigeria. Among the Yorubas, whose cultural influence predominates in the folk society of Trinidad, recognized marriage is always according to the legal pattern prescribed by the community." If the non-legal union was not an African inheritance, then what was it? It was a plantation construct, a forced adaptation to an unjust economic and social order. The descendants of the enslaved were taught by the plantation system that marriage was not for them. Marriage, they were made to believe, was a privilege of the upper class, a marker of respectability that they had not yet earned. And even so, even when they had the means to marry, they hesitated. Even when no financial barrier stood in the way, they opted instead for non-legal unions. Despite all of this, despite the legacy of slavery, despite the economic barriers, despite the psychological scars, marriage rates did rise. The numbers tell the story of a people determined to reclaim what was once denied. In 1881, marriage rates stood at 4 per 1,000 people, according to Matthew's book. 1911, it doubled, 8 per 1,000. In 1942, it rose again to 9.93 per 1,000. What caused the change? Matthews identifies several factors. One, the growth of the peasant communities as ex-slaves move away from plantation and establish free villages. Family stability increased. Two, the spread of education. As literacy rates rose, so too did the awareness of marriage as a legal and social institution. Three, the influence of religion. Churches, particularly Catholic missions, actively encouraged legal marriages and often assisted couples in making it possible. Progress was slow, but it was inevitable. As noted, the rise of peasant communities where ex-slaves built villages, established land ownership, and moved away from the estates helped families reclaim stability. Religious missions worked tirelessly to instill values of the Christian marriage. It was slow, but it was happening. The shadows of the past still stretches over us. Many of the same issues Matthew described in 1952 still exist. Economic hardships, absent fathers, and a lingering sense that marriage is for others, but not for us. But the difference is that we know where these patterns came from. They were not inevitable. They were designed by history. And what history has shaped, we can reshape. We must own our story. We must teach this history. We must stop blaming the victims and start dismantling the system that created them. We are not the sum of our oppressions. We are the sum of our survivals. And that is something to be proud of. The non-legal union still exists. The plantation ghost still lingers. But we must remember one crucial difference. We now know where this comes from. No longer can we accept the lazy explanation of cultural inferiority. No longer can we allow narratives that blame our ancestors for the crisis that they did not create. We now understand that this is not a moral failing, not a cultural flaw, but a historical consequence. And what history has made, we cannot make. Matthew's book is not just a diagnosis of the past. It is a call for action for the future. The plantation tried to erase the family, but the family survived. The system tried to deny us love, but love endured. It tells us that we are not bound by the change of the plantation forever. It tells us through education, through economic reform, through an awareness of our past, we can shape a different future. The plantation tried to erase the family, but the family survived. The system tried to deny us love, but love endured. And so, I leave you with this. History does not determine destiny. The legacy of slavery may be long, but our will to reclaim our identity is stronger. Let us reclaim it. Let us teach it. Let us build upon it. I thank you.
Shivan, you were very powerful and factual. I have been and continue to be a practicing Roman Catholic from my birth. But when the opportunity affords it, after Holy Mass on a Sunday, I visit my brothers in Woodford Street, Curep, where they practice what you may call spiritual Baptist worship, to learn, to understand, to share in how they see things, so that whereas the question of the plantation having impact, as per the research for the crisis in the West Indian family, we still have to ask, the more things change, the more they remain the same. It is now my pleasure to invite Corey Jilks, independent researcher, to share their views on the book and research in the Caribbean of the West Indian family as envisaged by Dr. Don Basil Matthews as a crisis at that time. Clearly, my apologies. Mr. Jilks is not here. He is? Please. Welcome, sir.
Well, now, I was tasked by Mr. Kamara with the dubious honor of speaking not so much about the dumb or his book, but the mysterious erasure of him from the academic history of this society. It's neither easy nor necessarily pleasant, but necessary it is. But for me to do so, I feel the need to first give a basic outline of the nature of the society he had to live in and how it continues to shape our society's dynamics today. Some of the groundwork, of course, was done by the previous speaker, so next time when you invite me, make sure I speak before him. That's just one of the enduring myths is that the colonizers gave us workable institutions to govern this space after the changing of flags in 1962. Let's be clear, Trinidad was set up to be an extractive workstation, not a sovereign, self-determining nation. And colonial imperatives that handed over control to imperialist imperatives in the teeth of the Cold War produce a strange societal mix that impacts even many of the heroes that we have that challenge the colonial imperialist order. Education, more correctly, schooling and churching, were key components in the creation of a servile, compliant worker, which is what the ruling classes wanted in this society. Indeed, Reverend John Sterling, one of the earliest architects of the education schemes for the post-emancipation colonies, explicitly stated that education must replace the whip in order to maintain control of the colonized mind. Now think about that. And think about how that impacts on the mind of the successful pupil, who then has to navigate the colonial ladder of upward mobility. One of the main demons in post-colonial societies, and when I say post-colonial, I always put post in italics because there's nothing post about it, is that the society is built upon, societies that are built upon exploitation and revolves around someone else's economic interests, is that the few heroes that emerge are often bestowed with messiah-like qualities, and as such, they tend to be very fiercely guarded. And that, coupled with the problematic concept of the nation state, creates a common fabricated identity. Those who consciously or unconsciously stand outside of that identity find themselves erased, or we should say today's parlance, cancelled. Such was the case with Don Basil Matthews. Much that made the man the legend that he became also meant that he was seen as defiant, non-compliant, subversive. And even today, such traits can be considered hazardous to one's health and one's wealth. But how else can we account for such silence of such a physically and intellectually towering figure? Here we had the country's first black monk, according to the October 28, 1946 Time magazine article. He himself was the first from here to be featured in Time magazine. But despite his being schooled in the College of the Immaculate Conception, as was explained earlier, he was not accepted into the Order of the Holy Ghost Fathers for reasons that can and has been explicitly cited as racism. The school he founded, St. Benedict's College, which I had the pleasure of attending, was arguably the first comprehensive school aimed at boys who, for various reasons, could not gain entry into the more prestigious elite schools. For the dumb, St. Benedict's model, fashioned in part from the ancient Greek model and from the even more ancient African sacred science schools along the Nile Valley, was to produce a complete human being with knowledge of self. However, in a colonized country, as it remains today in our neo-colonial societies, such emancipatory models are counter to the desired plantation imperatives for cheap, disposable, functionally illiterate labor force. Returning to the question of race, this goes much, much deeper in the Trinbagonian context than what we are accustomed hearing coming out of North America. We need to keep and to understand that. I recall a story in which the Don himself gave when I, as a boy in Form 4 and again in Form 5, had the privilege of meeting and interfacing with him. In both of his addresses to us, he told us he was strongly advised against building the school in Laramine because Laramine was, as he said, in the bush. And that's not where one would want to build a school of any kind, comprehensive or otherwise. Now, what relevance is that with regards to the concept of race? I will explain later. His going ahead with it can be considered defiant, subversive. To understand that, we need to keep firmly in mind that since the 17th and 18th centuries, gathering momentum in the 19th century, there was a body of scientific ideas that peasants and the working classes were inherently pollutants, carriers of diseases, and prone to impulsive, violent, and sexually predatory behavior, and so needed to be sequestered from the more deserving people of society. By the time of the building of St. Benedict's College, this belief had long since been transferred from the poor white working class to colonized African and Indian people. In fact, due to the writings of people such as J.H. Van Every, Carl Linnaeus, George Francis Train, John Stuart Mill, and other liberal thinkers, the darker the skin, the greater the capacity to carry diseases and the inability to govern themselves. This is what informed the policies that saw the creation of barrackyards and slums in countries such as ours. It should also be noted that the label attached to St. Benedict's College as the football college was mostly a derogatory one to be taken in that very context. That context of the inability of those people to do more than physical exertions. So while the Dom understood that the elevation of sports and music was integral to the development of the complete human being, in extractive plantation societies such as ours, with the elite grammar prestige school model as the standard to aspire to, the Dom's elevation of football in an institution situated in the bush, for bush people, and through this sport humiliated the established schools mostly based in the north, well, this was downright offensive. And for that, one can argue he was never forgiven. Further, his citing of the school in the Laramean community can in one sense be seen as him connecting a learning institution with the wider community. And let me point out at this point here that we've seen that the conflict between that in recent times, where there have been attempts to change the name of St. Benedict's football team, the Laramean Lions, to St. Benedict's Lions. And wait not for a concerted effort, mostly of some parents and stalwarts on chat groups, that change would have taken place. Because it was understood that in so doing, you are beginning the process of divorcing the school from the community it was meant to serve and to be connected with. This was something that the Don understood and stuck to. And again, for that, he was not forgiven. Further, given his writings, we know that he had a firm grounding in traditional African cultural notions of community and family, including communal or extended family. He found rich continuities in many parts of Trinidad. However, this ran counter to and undermined the notion of competitive individualism that was projected not as aggressively as it was in neoliberal disruptions beginning in the 1980s, but was nonetheless injected into the society since the 19th century as a means of retarding organized revolutionary action. The Dom was arguably the first to receive a PhD in sociology and anthropology, the first to lecture in sociology at the extramural department in UWI. He's said to be the father of Caribbean sociology, and as a sociologist, dealt with the sociology of the family, the sociology of sport, the sociology of development. The same man returned to Trinidad in 1944, gave a lecture called Cultural Heritage that examined culture and the family. In spite of all of that, we have, and this is not necessarily pounding the work of this great scholar, but we have Lloyd Braffett's work, which came out in 1953, 9 years after the work of the Dom, on the same topics, and yet almost no acknowledgement of this. A few years ago, there was a book written on the history of extramural studies, with no mention of Professor Matthews or his pioneering work. Another book written by Malcolm Cross, West Indian Social Problems, made no mention of the Dom. Neither does the book Readings in Caribbean Sociology. We have otherwise excellent books, such as The Family in the Caribbean, and Caribbean Sociology. Most of them, at best, make a brief mention, and some of them, none at all. These are questions we need to interrogate and put direct questions to and have direct answers. This was not by accident. Much of this had to be by design. He saw the effects the presence of the US military had on an already besieged social fabric of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly the rise in prostitution, and began writing on it. Again, defiance and subversion. These were the days when it was unthinkable for a priest, let alone a black one, to be writing on prostitution, and in a way that no doubt called into question the legitimacy of the militarization of the country. And this is very important given the fact that we just signed a new SOFA agreement with the United States, because Venezuela have what they want. We need to make the connections. Influential figures saw to it that that work went no further. Perhaps we could look to the Concordat and his mixed feelings, if not outright opposition to that, which is still a thorny issue today. His position was that he built his school without the assistance of any holy order. And as such, he would not be dictated to as to who and how many of those people could come to the gates of his school. But again, we are looking at a challenge to the pretensions of the colonial church. In 2025, we still have a reflexive aversion to things African outside of the emancipation season. The Dom, decades before, was one of the few in his time who openly acknowledged the resilience and the legitimacy of African cultural continuities. In some of his writings, he spoke about people, some of them Christian, who nonetheless solemnly kept shrines to deities such as Ogun in their yards and other continuities that he saw in West Africa. Again, in a society such as this, things like that is unthinkable and unforgivable. And I am putting it to you that all of these is what essentially conspired to remove him from academic history, because such a person, somebody would have taken all out of the thoughts and want to emulate him. So what is to be done in closing? What are we to do? My argument is that we engage in the traditions of the Dom, aggressive, ground-based, political, social, theological education geared to the colonizing of the mind. The setting up of the Dom Basil debate series, the Dom Basil lecture series, preferably based in St. Benedict's College, of course. All of which geared towards creating a new generation of emancipatory thinkers who will transform the space, utilizing the traditions of the Dom, and who are not afraid to challenge and, if necessarily, unceremoniously kick down the tables and the gates that are preventing this society from moving in the direction that visionaries such as the Dom had seen long before us. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Corey. And as if to give a little substance to what he speaks of, in October of 2019, I rejoined the past Students Association of St. Benedict's College. And with some of my colleagues, I made it clear to them that I was not going to be involved in a talk shop. So we prepared, first of all, we held a meeting with the head of the Archdiocese, and I indicated to him that we will return with a 50-year development program. And he looked at me as if, well, boy, no, we're going to live 50 years from now. I said, that's not important. What I wanted was a 50-year development program and beyond for St. Benedict's College, and as we refer to the sports grounds, the Commons. This is a document that I submitted to him in February of 2020. And the disdain and discourtesy that was shown to us, I listened, I understood what is called the magisterium of the church, and I submitted a copy to the association. I kept my own copy because what we had prepared here, including building structure and equipment, we budgeted at $450 million US dollars, exclusive of Archdiocese funding. All we needed was the okay for us to do assessment of the two properties, evaluation and so on, to go forward. Well, that too was treated with disdain. So I kept my word, I'm not involved with a talk shop. And it motivated me to move, to form the Dom Basil Matthews Foundation, which is exclusive of Archdiocese control. And I did say initially that St. Benedict's La Romaine is but a grain of sand of the intellectual capacity and resilience of Dr. Dom Basil Matthews. So our foundation will move forward with that. And my good friend Corey, we will ensure that his legacy lives on. So, my dear ladies and gentlemen, I would now invite, I need my glasses. Sharia Mohammed, sociologist and researcher, to share a few words with us.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I think that's okay. Yeah. Okay, hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you all, and thank you, Kamara, for inviting me to speak today and, well, giving me the book. I unfortunately did not read it in its entirety. I will say that my understanding, my knowledge of Dom Basil Matthews has come from originally my work here at the Institute as an archivist. I've read about him in the Trinidad and Tobago Review. Otherwise, through word of mouth, I understand his contributions, and that I do not know most of them, let alone all of them, and that they're very numerous. So I'm very grateful for the republication of this book so that I will be able to get to know him better. Noted also was the undervaluation, as Corey just explained to us, and the reasons for that. I would also like to preface this with the fact that I am not Catholic, nor is my partner, who I am, I suppose, in a non-legal union with. We are not actually desirous of marrying, but we do intend to spend our lives together. I will explain as I go along, but I am thankful to the speakers who came before me for giving that historical context, this kind of sociological review, and also giving the DOM's contributions to these fields. And I suppose I am offering then an anti-colonial youth perspective that are informed by, I suppose, animist spiritual beliefs. I will admit that because I have not read the entire book, I cannot give a very generous account, as full as I would like, but I am also a careful reader, which sort of thwarted my progress. And I want to open then with a quote that is near the beginning of the book that I found troubling, in order to situate my worldview, and then I will get into my comments on what I have read so far. So I appreciate the wide range of sources in the book, although I have not been able to investigate them myself. They do seem to be Catholic in orientation. So the quote is, "History has no record of any form of marriage or the family which has made a greater contribution to the civilization of mankind than the Christian family." So when I first read that, given my worldview, I was a bit unsettled. But upon review, I think it tracks. I think, according to my understanding of civilization as not so necessarily an all-positive force, civilization, as I understand it, has to do with the domestication of humans. That is, pacification as a suppression of dissent rather than the bringing of liberation for all. So civilization in our space and time, I understand as the process by which the oppressed peasants develop into settlers, or as close as they can be to them, divorced from their traditional life ways and their relations to the land and each other. So to become civilized, as I understand it, is to enter society as a user of the natural world rather than understanding one's part in and of it. Relationality in this understanding is then determined by law or the word rather than by the participants and their community of relations. So in my vernacular, which is my worldview expressed, peasant is a principled or honorable term, and civilized has a little bit of a pejorative connotation. I believe we should live in good relations with each other, which is what I think we mean when we say we are civil with each other. But I think we must also be wary of how our understanding of reality, our worldviews, and how we understand our relationship to our environment and place in it influence the ways that we relate to each other. I have a note. In my worldview, problems or threats to Western social organization, as he speaks of on, I think, page 13 somewhere, 12, are not necessarily bad things. That non-legal union is a problem or issue to the church and the state alike is fertile for thought. I think that is a quote from page 12 directly. I think this is fertile for thought. I think it's imperative to deconstruct colonial or civilized means of relating to each other in favor of constructing or reconstructing decolonial indigenous ones. So I think when we see humans as a species apart from and superior to others, and when we act in accordance with this belief, we can actually harm our relations with each other. And that's each other humans and each other non-human beings that exist with us. I don't think a person's life and values should be judged on their adherence to a belief in the superiority of particular religious ideals for reproductive groupings, and that should be linked to morality. Rather, humans are reproductive animals like all else. None of us would be here without it. That said, there's no problem with groupings that are based on familial ties. This has typically been the norm in our history. It's an emergent process. Most human groups, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, background, have tended to gather along familial ties. I think the problem, in my opinion, comes when there's a normative family structure that pressures people to conform to religiously sanctioned structures. So that is when relational structures are judged and socially sanctioned or ostracized, shamed, judged, according to deviation from a norm. But who sets the standards? As one of the speakers was telling us before, stories always have tellers. Objectivity, in essence, is a myth in reporting. Every publication has a story. I would say even a World Bank statistical report or an act of parliament is a story that has tellers and writers who are humans. The teller of this story is a person of notable and honorable actions, but who has specific religious beliefs and is also a man who has his own interpretation of family and relationships in family based on these worldviews. So I think that what this story offers us is a very good jumping off point, in my view, for critique, and a very important source that will enrich any analysis of relational styles, family organization, and in particular, the attitudes of the church and the role it plays in offering judgments on morality. I believe, however, that we are all moral judges and must develop our sense of morality, and this should not rely only on our religious views and upbringing, but on our experience in life, our interrelationships with people and the modern human will as well. I think we should develop our moral sense according to the collective values and experiences and the plural cultural understandings of our society. The richness of our cultures, and that is our multiculturalism, should be reflected in our moral, aesthetic, and logical senses. I understand why there are many comparisons to European and North American societies, given the situatedness of the author, although I agree that these should be troubled. I believe there is definitely value in doing comparative studies with West and Central African societies, as well as Indian, South Chinese, even Syrian and Lebanese family structures, as these are our ancestral family structures. Certainly other Creole societies in the Americas would be fertile sources of information as well. I think also that these comparative studies should be done both in the period that he outlines in this book as well as the contemporary one. I also want to just add one more level of situatedness that this book, and it was published before even my parents were alive, so perhaps the divergence of views has something to do with the two generations of space in between. So I also want to ask why we measure what we measure. In measuring, we do impose our observational bias. If we do not know how to measure a property that is present, or we measure it as a level of a negative indicator according to our worldview, we may miss vital information that it is otherwise giving us. I'm thinking in this specific instance how he speaks of 65% of births in 1921 being illegitimate. This is according to the idea that births out of wedlock are morally inferior to those within. So he includes ceremonially valid but legally unrecognized Indian marriages in this figure of illegitimate births. However, this means 100% of the births in the Americas prior to colonization were illegitimate. One must therefore reread illegitimate, which carries a negative connotation, as not socially sanctioned, specifically in this case by the church. If something is the norm according to emergent processes, that is, it emerges from the everyday life of people, perhaps that is actually the most legitimate in the sense that that is what takes place. It's what comes according to the flow of human interactions every day. No child who is born is illegal. Reproduction is a most natural process. People are not illegal. However, laws can be divorced from reality and also morally flawed. Slavery, after all, was a legal system, and the partition of Africa by European colonial powers followed a series of agreements which were enshrined in legal language, as did the administration of the colonies that today comprise the Caribbean. The colonial project was also sanctioned by the church and is responsible for the spread of Christianity in this region, although it is only partly responsible for the spread of Christianity in Africa and Asia, which follow different trajectories. Overall, I would say that this book offers a jumping off point for a lot of other potential areas of research. Some that I had considered were more gender and age diverse views on non-marital unions. So that is investigations into what women, men, and even children think about non-legal unions as defined by this text. An investigation into contemporary family and household economic and social management, and even an investigation into Caribbean polyamory, which is a spectrum of practices, which includes polygamy in a socially sanctioned, in some cases religiously sanctioned sense, but also just the kinds of families where you have siblings from different parents and of different lineages. That exists is not necessarily a social ill, although some of the social outcomes of that are felt as negative by some people. It is not 100% that way. An analysis as well of, as I was mentioning before, family management in different cultures and ethnicities that are present in the Trinidad and Tobago space could also be a jumping off point, and that this text would be an indispensable resource in conducting any of these research, these fields of research. So, to close, I would say that this book is a crucial text in analyzing the family in the West Indian space, in particular Trinidad and Tobago. And I am very grateful to Kamara for asking me to present today and for inspiring me to engage in this analysis. I hope to contribute some more in due time as I finish the book. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ms. Mohammed. Clearly, we could do a little better than that. There must be a bit of falsehood in that expression by Shakespeare that youth is wasted on the young, not with Ms. Mohammed. Our next presenter is Dr. Russell Foote, sociologist and author, who we have the pleasure of hearing your auspicious views, sir. Please, Dr. Foote.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have heard much about Don Basil Matthew's works on the crisis of the family and his works for St. Benedict's College, which he started and so on. I would want to focus on, does his work really have implications for what we can do to resolve some of our problems today in the education system and otherwise? And I would say absolutely yes. and try and give some examples. In the area of, now he operated at a time when the context was most definitely far different from today's. And in that context, our school community, students, relationship, at that point in time, quote unquote, in the bush, as a previous speaker mentioned, and in the type of society existing then, which was suitably covered by previous speakers, it would have been indeed quite difficult. And you know, it's almost, one tends to think that one person can't really make a difference. So it's amazing that one person, Don Basil Matthews, made such a difference despite the circumstances and so on. Now, the history, all the historical details you have heard, evolves into a sociology and a psychology in later years, in fact, changing sociologies and changing psychologies, changing contexts, and changing individuals. So Don Basil Matthews's contribution in a number of areas, for example, would have contributed in a way that we could learn from and act on in terms of education. For example, we have a very narrow view of education as about purely accumulating knowledge for self. You put that on a CV and feel good and so on and so on. But is that all? Is that education? When in truth and in fact, education really has a threefold objective: to refine knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And we saw that happening with Don Basil's work with students then at St. Benedict's College, where you had that refinement. But that refinement was of non-academically inclined young people. And one would have thought, as many think today, that those who are non-academically inclined cannot learn. They're not interested. But learning and teaching does not always, are more effectively done in the non-academic areas. When we, as Don Basil Matthews' work with the boys revealed, right? He was teaching them. I know we may not see that as teaching, but he was teaching them in the sense that from the point of view of teaching as reaching, he was reaching them, and he had reached them, and he was able to motivate them. And today we have challenges of how do we motivate students? How do we teach students? How do we reach them? We have so many fighting in our schools. There's a Don Basil, I saw a Don Basil, I will call it, model, quote unquote, or approach for motivating and teaching and learning to take place. And it is more effectively done in non-academic areas. Sports, which is what the DOM used then. That triangular relationship between community, school, and students, again, a dynamic one in which families are the center. But what is a family, and why do we have issues with family and the different types of families and so on and so on? Yes, we need the research, but one of the basic challenges or issues impacting on family life, and it's not only the African family life, all ethnicities have family issues and challenges and so on. But one of the basic issues is gender differences. Males and females think, feel, and act differently, even independent of our historical past and so on and so on. Think, feel, and act differently. And once there are differences, and people are not trained to handle differences, and we probably tend to feel, and yes, we must teach them values, talk to them about this and that. People learn more, students learn more, whether they are academic or not, through the non-academic means. That curricular, that extracurricular activities that we may assume in today's society, well, you're just playing, you're not learning anything from that. Time to pick up your books and, and so on. And given the achievement-orientedness of our societies, that we must have these qualifications and so on to make something of ourselves, to live successfully in a society, raises the other question of what is a society? What does a society need to function properly? I think today we couldn't care less about what a society needs and what we need to function properly. We need all types of workers, the academic and the non-academic. And interestingly enough, even when we are academically qualified, as I taught teaching in several tertiary institutions, I used to point out and raise the question, what's the purpose of the academic qualifications? That when you get it, you will find yourself at some point having to serve and help people who are struggling to help themselves, whether it's poverty, some form of inequalities, gender issues, child abuse, family life issues, and so on and so on. Even the academics have to be servants. And once we are not willing to serve and help others, then it becomes a self-centered kind of exercise. Basil Matthews did a lot of research. Today we do a lot of research, yes. But his research was a problem-solving research, which led him in later years to action to help the young people in La Romaine through the St. Benedict's College, through that institution. Right? So his contributions were real in terms of educating, motivating, teaching, learning, problem-solving research that created possibilities and pathways for the individuals then, the football team then, right, and others in the college and the community, right, and families. So I'm just raising some issues that we face today in terms of education, teaching, learning, motivating young people, family life, and the solution is there in the Basil Matthews approach. And out of that, I would like to suggest that we immediately, not 5 years from now, it's good to know that the foundation had established this, what we were informed of here, 50-year plan. But that we immediately establish a committee to develop an action plan to build on that kind of sports model, so to speak, that Basil Matthews established, and take it and get other schools involved. That is teaching. It's not in front of a classroom, but it's the more effective way of reaching our young people. As one who I've taught in several, I don't like to say problematic schools, because they weren't problematic. The biggest problems in the lives of children and teenagers are adults. Adults are the biggest problems in the lives of children and teenagers because of what we say and do, unconsciously aware that they are learning from us, and what we did not say or do, and so on and so on. Right? Good. So I think we need a committee like that to start to act. We get through to them most effectively through action and not talking. I'm tired hearing about this talk. Too much talking. And our students, when we look at the structure of the secondary school system, with a large number of, well, what used to be known as junior second, senior secondary school, in proportion to the prestige schools, clearly the larger percentage of students who are, I don't like the word failing, but who are failing are greater than those who are passing and getting 5, 7, 8 subjects and going on to A-levels. They would not shoot anybody. They would hardly be, well, I can't say they weren't engaged in corruption, but they would hardly be shooting anybody and fighting in schools and so on. So the larger proportion of our young people need action. But they're not going to wait on us, to finish talk and have a committee meeting and do X, Y, and Z. They are going to live. Whether we like it or not, they will do something legal or illegal, but attractive to them. So we have to act now. So if you are interested in establishing a committee under the umbrella of the foundation, I am one who's willing, and I would suggest whoever, if you know somebody else, let's get together, do something, come up. We have an action plan already, and let's get to implementation and really do something and reach our young people. We are not reaching them, we are simply talking to them. And we could do better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foote. You are welcome, and you are now part of the foundation. Just to give you a quick oversight as to what we had proposed was 23 additional functions and academic fields that we propose for what we call the campus and the sports complex. But as I said, that was subject to a certain kind of behavior. And we say, thank you, but no thank you, church. We will go on our own without Archdiocese control. It is indeed my absolute pleasure to invite Professor Winston Ducaran, economist emeritus, to share a few greetings with us on behalf of one of our other illustrious Benedictines. Professor, thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Colleagues, this has been an extraordinary evening. A lot of scholarly work have come together, and it is to the credit of our dear Professor Dr. Don Basil Matthews, that so many years after he has done his work, that we here are gathering to see how we can link that work to the problems we have at hand, as our last speaker challenged us to do. it was one of the students who is here, Patrick Edwards, who I taught when I was at St. Benedict's College, who called me last night, or night before, I believe, and asked me whether I will come and read a message from another one of the lecturers at St. Benedict's College during his time, who is now residing in Canada, and I could read what he said. And I said, okay, I always like to support St. Benedict's College, as Mr. Renwick knows, so I will be here to do that. But when I heard what the subject was, I recollect a talk that I was asked by our good friend, Kasara Kamara, to give some time ago on Don Basil Matthews. And I just want to read one sentence from what I said then, before I read Dr. Sahadev Vasudev's commentary. And this is what I said. Crisis of the West Indian Family is an epic book of Dom Basil Matthews, which put him among the great scholars of his time, in line with M.G. Smith, R.T. Smith, and Lloyd Braffit's, which was mentioned earlier, social stratification and cultural pluralism. These publications unearth ideas and analysis that remain as relevant today as when they were first published during the 1940s and 1950s, written when Trinidad and Tobago was heading towards a discussion on political independence. Today confirms that I, who have never studied his book in great detail, was right in my perception. Because what I've heard here today from the historian, from the sociologists, from the researchers who have studied the details of his book have now made me feel that I was quite correct when I made this statement about a year ago in San Fernando at that function. At that time, I was speaking about Dr. Basil Matthews' ideas for nationhood, and was comparing what his concept of nationhood was and what the concept of the then Prime Minister, Dr. Williams' concept of nationhood was, and was arguing that he, being a sociologist and a man of spiritual credentials, had a more relevant perspective on the watchwords of nationhood than Dr. Williams, who was a scholar in his own right, but who was more interested in power as opposed to ideas. But that is for another time. And I believe I'm just very happy that I'm here to get confirmation of my thinking. What I was asked by Patrick Edwards to do is to read a commentary written by Professor Sahadev Vasudev. Sahadev Vasudev taught history at University College in British Columbia, Canada. He taught previously at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. He was a member of the Senate in Trinidad and Tobago, 1981 to 1991. He served as a member of Parliament and Minister of External Affairs and International Trade from 1988 to 1991 in the government of Trinidad and Tobago. He has published widely in the field of history and international relations, and he taught at St. Benedict's College, of which many of his students followed in his path. This is what he wrote from British Columbia. The publication of this book is long overdue, which should be the republication. Scholars engaged in Caribbean research, history, and sociology will still welcome this publication by the late scholar and distinguished son of the Trinidad and Tobago, Dom Basil Matthews, PhD. Notwithstanding their preference to have had this manuscript in my generation sometime in the last century. I recall the yearning of this publication during the famous Williams-Matthew debate in the mid-1950s. But it was not possible because of circumstances known to many of us at that time to get a copy of it. Yet we are blessed that a work of such eminence and quality was never too late for acquisition by libraries and bookshelves everywhere. In essence, the debate of the West Indian family, its structure and challenges, its merits and demerits, have justifiably qualified for publication and discussion. Students and others would certainly welcome its content and dynamic nature and are still useful in the study of the colonial West Indian family. Dom Basil was my teacher, mentor, and an academic activist. Someone who shared the cultural direction of Trinidad and Tobago in the last half of the 20th century. So many of us present here today will bear testimony to this reality. He was, as we are aware, the architect of St. Benedict's College, La Romaine, in South Trinidad. It is through his work and devotion that so many were able to receive a secondary education and exposure to the larger world community. Today, a Benedictine can be found in any part of the world, a tribute to Dom Basil himself. Thanks to the world of Dom Basil, and so many have been saying over the last 65 or so years, and as Professor David Traboulet, among other dedicated tutors, have made this possible under Don Basil's guidance and leadership. As we gather here today on this auspicious occasion, not only are we here to sing the praises of the Dom, but the impact which he had had on the lives, particularly the young people, especially the boys, as the beneficiaries of soccer in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider CARICOM region. Almost 3/4 of a century ago, this book, as republished here today, will be useful and instructive in understanding the socio-cultural history of Black people in our country. So much of the dimensions of the progress and so much of the drawbacks in the socio-cultural life of our people, and what explanation we can provide to justify such positive and negative developments in our people's evolution. So I thank you very much for this opportunity. May God bless the soul of Don Basil, and may the generation of people who fell under the purview continue to prosper here in the Caribbean and the wider world. So Hadi Ubasti, retired Professor Emeritus, History and International Relations, University of British Columbia in Kaloa campus, British Columbia, Canada. Thank you.
You know, they always say confession is good for the soul. Well, I used to sit at the feet of my maths lecturer, Winston Dukaran at St. Benedict's College. Now, he knew cover to cover the 3 hard books of Andrew Camacho. Some of you don't know about that fella, but all right. But I have to apologize, sir. I never got further than your lessons sitting at your feet. I tried my best. I understood Pythagoras and a couple other things and a little bit of algebra here and there, but such is life. We now have retired His Excellency Patrick Edwards, who from time to time is pulled out of retirement to continue his extensive work in international and diplomatic relations on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago. Patrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. When we look at the program which was prepared for today's function, neither Winston Dukran nor myself is included. But it's good, because if what we say doesn't resonate, then there'll be no record that we participated. So we would be safe from condemnation in the future. I have been requested, or I have been in touch, as Winston just pointed out, with both Sahadev Basil and the person who I'm going to bring greetings on behalf, Mr. Gilman Figaro. Now, therein hangs a tale. I entered St. Benedict's College in September 1960 and graduated in July, August 1967 and taught for 1 year. And I went on and joined the diplomatic service. So 43 years in the diplomatic service, 44 years only in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, representing Trinidad and Tobago all over the world. But that is not the interesting part. I was fortunate to, in the span of the 7 years, to sit at the feet and to be tutored by a number of teachers, including Reginald Renwick, who is right here. The Grand Master is affectionately referred to, Reggie, as well as the legendary Sahadev Basil and Professor Winston Dukran. They are both professors. It is interesting that that football school of St. Benedict College, created by Don Basil Matthews, with a philosophical grounding in the concept of the Renaissance man, the complete man, the full man, who could operate in a variety of spheres and serve the benefit of his country or the nation. And I mentioned Winston Dukran and Sahadev Basil before going on to deliver the greetings from Gilman Figaro for 2 reasons. Winston Dukran taught me economics at A levels. Sahadev Basil taught me history at A levels. Between these two intellectual titans, I emerged and went and joined the diplomatic service. And these two intellectual titans were two of the foreign ministers of Trinidad and Tobago, and did a marvelous job. And it is their training, their knowledge, their interest in seeing that their charges, as my mother would say, make a man of themselves, that I could stand here today and speak with Sahadeo Basil, Professor Sahadeo Basil, and together invited Winston to bring greetings on the launch of this publication. I may be, and I'm subject to correction if I'm wrong, maybe the only student who graduated from the portals of St. Benedict College and served for 43 years in the diplomatic service under the two teachers who taught me A-level, which I got distinctions and passed, and went on to be my foreign minister. So I had the Basil was my first foreign minister, and I had Winston Dukran, my second foreign minister, over the span of 43 years. And I thought this was amazing. And of course, I had Reggie, who taught me Spanish, an excellent teacher, but I never turned out to be a linguist because I was one of the wayward, irresponsible students that fell under his charge. So it is my privilege, therefore, to be associated with this August Assembly and our very distinguished chairman, to bring greetings on behalf of Gilman T. Figaro. Now, many of you will be familiar with Gilman Figaro, and for those who are not familiar, among the many accolades that Gilman has achieved is one of, as chairman of the internationally renowned Sunshine Awards. There was a very big article in Sunshine Award recently. And Gilman Figaro is the founder and president of the Sunshine Awards. And I tried to get him to come down. He's an unrepentant Benedictine, and equally an admirer of Dom Basil. And of course, it's the training that we got from Winston and all the others that enabled him to shine on the international plane and launch the Sunshine Award, among other things, as I said, in which the United Nations has endorsed it, in which the founder of the Grammys have endorsed it, and he has received accolades, over 11 or 15 international accolades in support of his work, and one of which was when there was this massive famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s, where he engaged, I think, nearly 100 internationally renowned artists and produced this book, produced a song, raising funds for Africa in those days in the 1980s. And of course, he has left an indelible mark, and he still continues to be a prolific writer and making tremendous contributions and keeping the flag, the Benedictine flag, flying. And I'm proud to be associated with all those. And as a consequence now, it is now my privilege to read the greetings on behalf of Gilman T. Figaro. And it goes like this. Dear Mr. Chairman, I wish to extend my warmest congratulations to Casala Camara, Alvin Weeks, and their team on the relaunch of Dom Basil Matthews' book titled Crisis of the West Indian Family, which was originally published by the Extramural Department of the University College of the West Indies in 1953. Organizing such a momentous event requires dedication and a true passion for celebrating the seminal and unparalleled sociological analysis of Trinidad and Tobago in the mid-20th century, as seen through the eyes of Dom Basil Matthews. It was a monumental analytical study. Trinidad and Tobago's post-emancipation societal and class structures that were as relevant then and undoubtedly even more significant in contemporary society. The relaunch of this publication today is a fitting tribute to the extraordinary work of Dom Basil Matthews, whose talent, insight, and dedication have given us a book that left a lasting impact on individuals and the society at large. Crisis of the West Indian Family is more than just a collection of words. It is a testament to the power of Dr. Matthews' vision, knowledge, and inspiration. He has not only shared his wisdom, but has also enriched the lives of readers igniting important conversations and creating new perspectives of societal and family values in pre- and post-emancipation Trinidad and Tobago. Casala Camara, Alvin, and their team efforts in bringing this event to life will reflect in the years to come as one of the highlights of the same spirit, passion, and commitment that the book embodies. I have no doubt that the relaunch of this book will long be remembered as one of the highlights in the literary community of our country. Congratulations on a job well done. I wish them continued success in all their future endeavors. With appreciation and highest regards, Gilman T. Figaro, former student of St. Benedict College, chairman and founder of the Sunshine Awards. Now that I have carried out the duties that have been accorded to me, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to take my seat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Once upon a time in 1990, he and I worked together because of my substantive position to organize air transport for the safari of our then Prime Minister Robinson to Africa, along with Minister Sahadeo Basil. Subject to certain developments, by January 91, Bibi said, go home. But that is life. What is important is that the Prime Minister did have a successful safari and was duly honored as Chief Olokun Ukbar, Olokun Ukbaba of Niife. So that that's the way the cookie crumbles at times, you know. I certainly would like to invite my dear friend, Reginald Renwick, to share a few words with us before Casala will come on to do the vote of thanks. And then Professor Renwick will give us the closing prayer.
Thank you so much, Richard. I will try to be as succinct as possible, but there are some things that I need to say. Well, first of all, I would like to introduce members of my family here. The Wilson family, would please stand. They're here today. Their father, Mr. Max Wilson, deceased Max was my sister's husband. And I hold them very dear, and they are very meaningful to me in the realm of things as far as Basil Matthews is concerned. Thank you so much, and I had to recognize them today. The work that we have today, for your information, is only part of his work with respect to his PhD thesis. Okay, I want you all to keep that in mind, and I'm working with the family here in doing some other things for other publications of the entire work itself, as well as his master's thesis itself. And, but there's so much more that Dom has done in terms of writings. When he was at Howard University with me, he wrote on the Black American family, Black family, and he instituted what is called the Black perspective in terms of the American system as a course structure at the Graduate School of Social Work at Howard University. And then he went on to the School of Communications to do other work also. So in terms of his work, etc., that was done. And other things that he wrote in terms of culture culture in Trinidad and Tobago. And for some of you, in terms of, you talk about inclusive, he was very, very fond of Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore. And he has written extensively on Tagore also. And we need to keep all these things in mind in terms of, from a historical perspective, and in terms of academic perspective, what his writings were. So it's not only confined to Crisis in the West Indian Family. Okay, and the Dom lived with me, and in his old age, I took care of the Dom. And as a matter of fact, as a young student at St. Ben's College, what it meant to me to graduate, the first graduate of St. Ben's College, myself, Peter Ninging, may God bless his soul, and Andrew Henry, we were the first of that class of 1961 higher school certificate class to pass exam and teach at St. Ben's College. And this was the crowning glory, you know, because he produced a set of students who were able to go back and teach at St. Ben's College. And what it meant in terms of, if we can make it, every other Benedict's man could make it, is that fact, all right? Also, in terms of the Dharma, in terms of his thinking, even though he wrote this several years ago, and sometimes we used to have discussions late at night, you know, and I would tell him, you know, Dom, my mother and my father was friending. All you know is friending, they never got married. What's the deal? He says, Reggie, you are still a child of God, and that's the name of the game, all right? And this is why the Dom took a lot of blows in terms of this question of concordat also. And last year when I spoke at the symposium, I mentioned in terms of what Dom's feelings were in terms of concordat, and especially with respect to bringing in students. His feeling was that if you bring in a child in the 20%, what is wrong if you bring in a child other than the 20% in Form 2 or Form 3? You're still bringing in a child. They are God's children. And nothing is wrong with that. And even if they have talent and they could play football, he also said, if you have talent, use it for the Lord. All right? Now, and one of the kind of things with respect to football and music, I was the only one boy to reach Form 6 and play music. And I got a lot of blows studying in San Fernando Library. When time come for exams, the fellas we used to study, and fellas used to say, Reggie boy, what you write? All you write in 80? What Benedict could write 80? And before I could tell them I'm doing Latin for 80, Spanish, English, and French, a man jump up and ball football and music. You see the stigma? I mean, instead of encouraging me, the stigma moved on. All you could do is write football and music. But I show all them bitch and the brother, I could pass. All right, and I passed, and Dom hired me. And you know what? He made me a member of his board. Some of them still come and asking me, Reggie, tell the Dom I need a job now. I say, go and ask Brother Jerome, who was the principal of the presentation. Go and ask Mr. Sunarayan, who was principal in Aprima. Why come to me then? You're criticizing Benedict's, but yet when I pass exam, you want to come asking me. All right? And so, you know, in terms of all the years I worked at St. Ben's College, the Dom and I traveled. For some reason, he said, look, Reg, I got this professorship at Talladega College, but I'm not going to Alabama by myself. He said, pack your bags. Forget second year and third year at UWI and pack your bags, because I had passed part one. At UWI, I did all the courses, the survey courses, everything. And we went to Alabama. It wasn't easy. Wallace land, the land of Joel Wallace in 1969. And it wasn't easy in terms of he in one little room and I in a little room. We had to walk to get breakfast in the cold and lunch and sometimes. And it was a question of sacrifice. And this is where I saw a man who was a principal in terms of going to Alabama and sacrificing, all right, starting all over at 58 years old. This government never gave him a pension, never gave him a gratuity. Uncle Ozzy said, well, look, let me sue him now. Let me sue government. But Dom said, leave it, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. All right? And he never got a pension from this country, for which he was entitled as a principal and founder and principal emeritus of St. Ben's College for over 12 years. From 1956 to 1968. Never got a dime, never got a cent. So you see how this man had to suffer and go. And another thing, with all the sufferings and the church and all this sort of thing, it's the same church when he had difficult problems, they did not come to his rescue. I, Reginald Rennick, see that, and I know it for a fact. I got a lot of blows. at the symposium. They said I'm preaching race in the church, but you got to recognize what went on in those days. And I know in 1985, the Pope, something came to him. He apologized for the role the Catholic Church played in slavery. And by apologizing in slavery, it came here in the Caribbean, in the plantation economy, and this is what the church was responsible for. He apologized to everybody as yet. There still need more to be done. Think about it. Think about it. I'm not preaching racism, all right, but I'm telling you the truth. Look it up. He did apologize to Africa for the role the Catholic Church played in slavery. Okay? Finally, I just want to say a few words in terms of people, in terms of we have produced four senators, Junior Kamijang. We have produced Sahade Basil. We have produced Sashri Moonan. All right? And we have produced my classmate Neil Dinanath Bagan in the Robinson administration, 4 senators. We have produced 3 ambassadors, Patrick Edwards. We have produced Obika. And we have produced Larry Rosso. And Larry's wife was also an ambassador in Europe. So we have produced that. We have produced many teachers. I mean, Deputy Commissioner of Police and teachers and all this sort of things. Medical doctors, lawyers. One of my classmates, Hendrik Susinat, is a senior counsel in San Fernando. Class of 1960, high school, senior Cambridge. And we have produced so many, all right? Lawyers all over the world and doctors, etc. And what St. Benedict's means to me, one of the kind of things, and I want to tell you, this whole question about Dr. Dom Basil Matthews, as far as I'm concerned, Dom Basil Matthews, OSB, MA, PhD. You ever wonder why in Trinidad, all the monks who have been trained at Mount St. Ben's, they are Doms. The word dom comes from the Latin word dominus. But why does he only have one dom? You refer to who you're talking about? The dom. All right? It's true. All right? Only one dom in Trinidad and Tobago. All right? Something has to be right. Okay? So when you're saying Dr. Dom, you clear that up now, man. The man is Dom Basil Matthews, not Dr. Dom. All over the dom. And who is the dom? All right? And then we have to understand certain things. I want you to bear in mind, today is very significant for me. I just came back from Point Fontaine. I chaired the funeral for Lloyd de Leon, and today was his 40 days. And I had to share that in Point Fontaine today. And from Point to come here is very difficult and taxing for me. And also, today is down, and today we're having this celebration. So maybe, it's the divine guidance, and God ordained that we're all here today, to do this thing. In addition to which, on April the 7th, how many of you know that was his passing of his anniversary 2 days ago, all right? April the 7th, and he was buried on April the 20th, okay, 1999. So, also in terms of, you're talking about people, he mentioned Patrick Edwards. Patrick Edwards mentioned Figgy. Figgy was one of my students in Spanish and music also. And when Leroy died, he said, Reg, you have to play this song. Tell St. Peter I'll be there by the mighty Sparrow, that Figgy and Sparrow worked on to produce. Okay? So that's very, very important. So I just wanted to let you know in terms of briefings, in terms of my perspective. I honored a man. Things were hard with him. And with me, he had his ways, and sometimes there were little fun things he would tell me. I mean, one night I went out, and I come back late. Like a good father and a good parent, the Dom was waiting for me. And the man said, when he gave vexed, he used to call me Mr. Rennick. Or he called me Lord Asquith, because Asquith is my second name. He said, your nocturnal sorties have caused me great pangs of insomnia. So much so, I have resorted to somnambulism. So I myself, a little thing in my head, what the man say, nocturnal. So although nocturnal is denied. And my friends tell me so. So he tell me, when the night come and you're driven, I can't sleep. I'm walking in my sleep. Somnambulism, I learn a new word. But, little things like that. And Dom had fun with me, but he was very serious. My son born. Dom told me, and he came down here on vacation, he said, don't christen the child at all. I want to know how a Catholic priest could say, don't christen your child. But I came down here on a Friday night, Mommy tell me the christening is in the morning. I said, where in the morning? She said, the Dom said the christening is in Couva. I and mommy went up with my son to christen the child. Me, the dom say, listen, I taught you, you taught Vento. Vento have a right to christen this child. And he named the child Stefan. I said, well, Stefan is not your name. He said, my name is Stephen. Stephen is English, Stefan is Italian, so the child named after me. I couldn't fight him. Little things I remember. But in all, we have to work in terms of what Dom has produced, and we have to honor the legacy. We have to honor it because, you see, this painting there of the Dom, a few years ago, Trevor Morris called me, who was the president of PT, and said, Reg, they put the painting that Carlisle Ledgerwood painted on the ground in the back of the library. They say, Reg, you got to do a proposal. So I went up there, I and Ian Small, and we addressed the Catholic board. The only person who defended us was Father Merrick, Dwight Merrick, because he was a Benedict's man. And the stupidity was, the painting was painted because it was in his robes, and he was no longer a priest. Could you believe that? Thank God Father Merrick and the then Archbishop Harris was able to convince the Catholic Board of Education to put this picture back up in the library at St. Benedict's College, and this is where it should be. All right? Amen. So one of the kind of things that, come to my mind in terms of we have to honor. Sometimes we don't on our own. We never sometimes in Trinidad on our own, Something is wrong with us if we don't on our own and recognize for a generation and the legacy of things come. I've been talking for 5 minutes. He gave me 50 minutes to talk, but I took off the 0. That meant 5. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reggie. Just gave me a short reflection. On the day of his passing, I don't know how, but a member of the Wilson family found me at office on Donald Street to give me the news. And I said, what? I said, so where's the internship taking place? His internment, rather. They told me, San Juan Cemetery. I said, San Juan Cemetery? I said, hold on. So I called the Chancery, and I asked His Grace, what's his story? He said, well, we don't handle that. Talk to the abbot. I said, no problem. This is coincidental, the abbot is not here today. But anyway. Well, I got in touch with the abbot within minutes. And when he gave me the story of tralala, whatever, I gave him a few choice words. Because I used to have vacation in Mount St. Benedict. So I had to let him know that I knew all who are interned there, including their pet German Shepherd and whatever, right? So I met him at the St. John's the Baptist Church in San Juan that afternoon, or the afternoon of the funeral. And I gave him a few more choice words because I'm now meeting him in person for the first time. He looked at me. I said, yes, I am he who you spoke with, and I must let you know how I feel about the discrimination by my church. Of course, I reminded him of the few choice words that I had given him on the phone a day or two before. And I said to myself, oh, but how the great are treated with disdain. But the foundation of which Dr. Foote and others will be part of will correct that in due course. So, as we come to vote of thanks, my dear friend and the chief organizer and author of the symposium last year and this evening's exercise, I now invite my dear Kasala Kamara to give you a vote of thanks.
Pleasant good night, brothers and sisters. I would just want to say thanks, because when I reflect on what has been said today, I believe before I say thanks, we all need to put our claps together for a very excellent session. The relaunching of Crisis of the Family was first conceived by Brother Alvin Weeks, as he mentioned, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of St. Benedict's College. And I would want to state that he approached the family of Don Basil Matthews, Professor Lawrence Wilson, who responded positively and made it very clear that the approval is subject to certain conditions which related to copyright. So I believe we need to give a round of applause to the family of Dom Basil Matthews. The present situation in which the book was finally published, we had the intervention of Teddy Mohammed, the founder and chief executive officer of Caribbean Education and Publishers, a past student of St. Benedict's College. Brother Teddy Mohammed, however, is presently out of the country, and they did not only provide the book, the program was produced by the publishing house, and we got other support. So let us put our claps together for Teddy Mohammed and the Caribbean Education Publishing. Steve Sumad, sorry, I'm going too fast. One of the challenges of the first publication was that we did not have an original copy of the book. And Glenroy Haynes, who now resides in London, another past student, provided that original copy, and that is what made the publication possible, because originally they submitted a photocopy of the American edition. So let us give our claps together for Brother Glenroy Haynes. The actual production of the book was done by one of Brother Muhammad's employees in what I call the engine room. His name is Mohan. And he organized the original copy, converted it into the new publication, and we now have the new edition. So let us put our claps together for Brother Mohan. Professor Wilson made it very clear in his approval that we needed a scholar of a certain standard. And Professor David Traboulet, who is a past lecturer at St. Benedict's College, provided that new introduction. So even though it was done since 2011, we were able to use it, and we now have the new introduction courtesy Dr. Professor David Trabuli. So we now had the book in our hands, and we had now to organize this function. And Steve Sumad provided us with some financial resources. However, this is the time of Ramadan, and he is involved in the activities that go with Ramadan, so he could not be present. Let us give our appreciation for Brother Steve Suman. I would want to comment on what I heard today from the various presenters. And I would like to put all of them together in one package called intellectual firepower. Whether we are speaking in terms of the first presenter, Sister Sasha, whether we are speaking in terms of Brother Ramraj, whether we are talking in terms of Brother No. The first presenter, he's sitting at the back. Burton Sankarali, whether we are speaking in terms of Corey Jilks, whether we are speaking in terms of Sister Saria, or whether we are speaking in terms of Brother Russell Foote, who not only did an analysis, but pointed us in the direction of doing action. Let us give our claps together for all of the presenters. I hope I didn't leave out anyone. Good. And then we had our appreciations coming from former students, one, a past foreign affairs minister, past lecturer, and it was done by a past lecturer at the college, Brother Winston Dukaran. So let us put our claps together for the contributions of Dr. Sahadio Basdeo and Brother Winston Dukaran. And we have the appreciation of Gilman Figaro. And I could recall when I was preparing for my advanced level examinations, Gilman Figaro, myself, and another brother, we slept overnight in a hall called St. Austin's Hall. We used to call it Beaten Book in preparation for exams. And his appreciation was read by the esteemed Brother Patrick Edwards, who could be described as the embodiment of St. Benedict's College and what Don Basil Matthews represented. Let us put our claps together for Brother Patrick Edwards. I cannot forget the Brother Chairman, who has been able to manage the proceedings in a manner which has been so successful that I have not seen anyone really. In fact, he has been able to keep the rapt attention of most of us here in this very long session. Let us show our clap, our appreciation to the Brother Chairman, Brother Richard Tomwing. And how could I forget Brother Reginald Renwick, who came and shared with us the kind of experiences he had with Don Basil Matthews and guided us in terms of how we should always address him. Let us put our claps together for Brother Reginald Renwick, who also, he mentioned, was today at another function where we were commemorating one of our greatest footballers of all time, Leroy DeLeon. Okay, let us put our claps together for a job well done. And this could not have been possible without the presence of you who took your time to come and participate in this very historic function. In my closing remarks, I would just want to say, we have, oh my God. We have to always remember in keeping what is called the law of gratitude. Why are we here? We are here because Sister Suniti Maharaj and Carmel Bess made this venue available to us. The Lloyd Best Institute. And what took place here today was consistent with his commitment to independent thought and freedom. So let us put our claps together for that very important contribution. The sound system has provided us with the appropriate music and with the appropriate facilities, and we patiently await the recording of this event. So let us, as we conclude, not forget that great teaching of Don Basil Matthews, nihil omnino Christio. Thank you, brothers and sisters, until we meet again. And the chairman will continue. Thank you.
Good suggestion, Jimmy. Thank you. You want us, as the Benedictine group, to stand here for a group photograph, and thereafter we would have the you will have the apostolic greeting, Renwick. All right, I will speak to Vatican City for you, don't worry. Shall we?
The journey now start, the journey it now start. I was drifting on the lonely sea when a voice kept calling out to me. Keep on calling, calling, calling. I was shaking like a frightened child. I was shaking, shaking, shaking. Was out in the cold and I had nowhere to hide. I heard son, come, come, come. Don't be afraid. You just started your mission. The waters will be rough. Have faith and you will make it all the way up. 'Cause the journey now starts. The journey it now starts. The journey now starts. The journey it now starts. Sonny, do not give up. Don't ever. You put it here to survive. You are in charge of your life. I never look back, look ahead.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for Dom Basil Matthews, the principal, founder, and principal emeritus of St. Benedict's College, and for all that he has done for us. Heavenly Father, I ask, without a Dom, where would we have been today? So we pray for his family. We pray for all those who are gathered here, all the presenters, the discussants. We pray for all the administrators of the program. And Father, family, we say thank you so much. Thank you for this occasion. And as we leave, we take our egress, we say, ask you for traveling mercies as we leave to our respective homes. God bless you all in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. And I'm not a lay minister, okay?